Well, good morning, everybody. It's wonderful to be here with you. I was listening to the previous panel thinking I was sitting in the United States talking about a divided country. But we have another really tough subject to bring before you today, and that is the issue of the extreme marginalization of women, what happens to women in conflict, in a very pervasive way, sexual violence in conflict, an extreme tool of many of the wars today. We have refugee and asylum seekers at historic numbers and what they're going through. And at the same time, as was in the previous panel mentioned, have a reaction within host countries to this influx and terrible immigrant bashing going on. So these are very tough questions, both in terms of what we do about them, how we deal with sexual violence and conflict, what should happen, how are refugees being protected in terms of what they're undergoing today. And we could not have three more expert people to grapple with this morning. Arminka Helic has been the advisor to former Foreign Secretary William Hague. On these issues, she is in the House of Lords, grappling still with them, and very active in the PSVI initiative here in the UK. Sanj is with IRC, the International Rescue Committee, doing extraordinary work that they do on refugee issues. And the name David Miliband may be familiar to all of you. Well, he is heading up the IRC. And right here with me is Marchu, who is working with refugee women. And so we've got three different perspectives on this issue. By the time our panel finishes, hopefully, you'll be much better informed. I want to start with Arminka, who has her own personal experience on the issue of sexual violence and conflict. She was living in Bosnia during that terrible inferno that took place, where rape occurred on a scale that was just unimaginable. She had to leave Bosnia. She has been engaged on this issue since. But I think history gives us a perspective, an understanding, at least it should, so we don't repeat the worst of history. So Arminka, take us back to what was happening in Bosnia, because that will take us then to where we are today on this issue.
Thank you and good morning. Well, I'm not quite sure where to start in order to bring you here, because I came to live in this country on October the 2nd, 1992. And when I left Bosnia, which at the time was 50% mixed, and when I say 50% mixed, that means I was growing up in a country that used to be former Yugoslavia, and where you didn't know whether someone was a Muslim or a Catholic or an Orthodox Christian, and where these things were really something that you were brought up not to notice and not to care about. You cared about your friends in the school. You fancied boys, whether they were of this or that religion, and the religion never came into your daily life. And it was quite extraordinary to have an experience of war breaking out virtually out of nowhere, which showed how weak certain links and how weak the institutions were of the country at the time. And I must say, I was lucky enough, and even today I sometimes feel guilty for having had an opportunity to leave Bosnia in sort of late summer of 1992. And I realized that what happened to those who stayed behind, to some of my closest friends, was something I could never imagine happening, and something I couldn't imagine would be that my people or people of Bosnia would have been put through. And as Melanne has just said, one of the elements of overall military operations in that part of the world in the 90s included ethnic cleansing. And ethnic cleansing is a ugly phrase, but is a very precise phrase that describes what happens when one ethnic group decides, or when paramilitaries of one ethnic group, I must say, decide to interfere with ethnic mix of the country. So actions were taken not only to separate Muslims from Croats and Muslims from Orthodox Christians, but they were sort of taken to really imprint it upon their psyche that they are not to be part, ever be mixed again. And the process of ethnic cleansing that will finish with genocide in Srebrenica in 1995 started really with those sieges and shelling, but then an all-out attack on women who were seen almost as a part of that battlefield. And rape was used in a very organized way in order to inflict pain, in order to inflict humiliation, and in order to ensure that populations move. And it was probably more effective than anything else that you could use in these circumstances. And it was effective enough for my family when we heard that a town that is close to my hometown fell into the hands of Serbian paramilitaries, that we had to leave. The stories that I later heard of what happened to my friends, how they ended up in rape camps, how they were humiliated, inspired me in a small way when I eventually made it in this country, and I was working in the Foreign Office as a special advisor to William Hague to start a Preventing Sexual Violence initiative that is supposed to be about not only highlighting this horrendous crime, which I want to emphasize is not something that only happened in Bosnia. It is a part of every single conflict that we saw before then, and we have seen since then, and we will continue seeing unless and until we have measures in place and awareness in place that says this is a crime that cannot be tolerated, this is a crime that cannot be an afterthought in peace negotiations, this is a crime that doesn't just get mentioned, it's something that those who have perpetrated it have to take full responsibility for. Countries and leaders who have sanctioned it have to take full responsibility for. And if I can just say one more thing, what I would like to see in case of Bosnia is I don't want to see a whole nation being accused of committing a crime, or one ethnic group committing a crime against another, but it would be welcome to have a recognition that certain things have happened, some semblance of accountability, which in Bosnia has gone some way with the International War Crimes Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, etc., so that people feel that justice has been done, and that they can all move forward, and that you can really have the basis for a sustainable and long-term peace.
Well, thank you, Arminka. And she's exactly right in terms of the pervasiveness of this. Whether you're looking at Myanmar or Syria or the DRC, this is going on, and we will get to what do we have to do about it. But let me first go to Sanj, because you're working, IRC is in Syria, working both with victims there as well as those who are fleeing from the catastrophe that is ongoing. Give us a sense of what they're going through, and then we can move into what their needs are.
Well, yeah, to begin by saying I totally support what Arminka has said, because the reality is that sexual violence against women and girls occurs in every single emergency. You don't even need to wait for it to start to know that it will occur. That's the depressing reality. And I've worked in the field from Haiti to Mali, South Sudan, and Syria, and in every single one of those cases, we've seen sexual violence, and we will probably continue to see that occur. And that is something that falls on us as an international community to address. And yes, if you're wondering, there isn't a single instance where this is not an exception, including when I was in Liberia responding to Ebola, and there was a rape in an Ebola treatment unit of a woman in a bed. So if a world needs Me Too, you can imagine where the rule of law is no longer present in conflicts around the world, why we need more than we currently have. If truth is the first casualty of conflict, I think the second is going to be rule of law. And what that allows is people who are constrained merely by law to take action against people who've been made vulnerable by conflict, and women and girls are amongst them. And I use my words carefully, because let's be clear, these aren't victims or vulnerable people. We've made them vulnerable as women and girls in these situations by creating conflict. And going to Syria, I remember doing a needs assessment with a female gender-based violence expert on our team in Lebanon in 2012. It was unusual because we were told by UN assessments that had been done there wasn't sexual violence present or being reported by, at the time, only 35,000 Syrian refugees in Lebanon, which was odd to us based on what I've just told you. And we began a needs assessment. Many of those focus group discussions we ran, I wasn't able to participate in. It was led by my female colleague. And I watched her slowly degrade over 2 or 3 days of listening to those stories because they were too much, I think, to take in as one person hearing them. And eventually we called an early end to that assessment. We'd gathered enough data to indicate that this was not just a niche problem, this was a huge problem. Rape was being used and probably still is being used as a weapon in war in Syria. Women were being inflicted with horrifying experiences in order to control fighters or men generally in various ethnic communities. And more importantly, they did not have a channel to describe this. They had been asked in surveys to establish their refugee status to tick a box as to whether they'd been raped or not. That's not how this works. And the fact that not only do we not have an accurate way of diagnosing the problem, but that we don't even have solutions, either for addressing issues of justice or for care, means that we are far, far, far away from the solution. And why is that? Well, less than 0.014% of all humanitarian aid, so about 50 million in a budget of 41 billion globally, goes to address these kind of issues. Why is that? Well, we can have a longer discussion, but in many cases, decisions are made by male decision makers, which mean that this issue, having not been experienced by those decision makers, means it is trivialized or it's seen as a niche issue, or it's not one where if someone is hungry, they'll shout for it. If someone has been raped, they're not going to. So we have a great deal of work to do. I think part of the solution is people in this room recognizing that this is a problem. The thing I hear the most, and I heard it most recently yesterday, is why are we not interested in people with disabilities or children? What about other people's human rights? Why are women's rights so important? And it's not that other people's rights are less important. It's just that women's rights in crisis are so far separated from what we call human rights for others, or seen as too difficult in the midst of conflict to address, that we ignore them completely. And that's where, for us at the International Rescue Committee, it's essential that we put it back at the forefront. And every single program that's designed in a crisis has to take account of the services to women who are recovering, sometimes also being prevented from experiencing the kind of violence I've seen.
Well, thanks, Sanj, and you've given us a lot to unpack in that very brief description. Marchu works here in London, works with individuals, refugee women who are suffering from the consequences of what they've been through. Can you take us on a journey with a typical, imagine a lot of the problems are very similar, of what you go through, what you see, what they're going through most importantly?
Yeah, so I work for a small charity called Women for Refugee Women, and we have a drop-in every Monday where we see over 100 refugee and asylum-seeking women, and women at various levels of the immigration process. And one of the things that you talked about is the gender-based violence that occurs in conflict. But women are fleeing gender-based violence in countries where there are no wars. And one woman in particular said to me that, I may not have come fleeing conflict in my country, but I have come escaping war on us, which means war on women. And I think we need to acknowledge that. So in regards to, I'm just going to talk about a woman I'll call Helen, who I've been working with in recent times. Helen left her country, Eritrea, when she was a young woman. She escaped the conflict there. She went to Sudan and made the horrendous journey across the Sahara Desert and crossed the Mediterranean. And obviously on her journey, she had experience of multiple rapes. She was in the Calais camp for a while trying to get to safety in the UK. And when she came to the UK and claimed asylum here, her asylum was refused. And I think that's where we need to begin, in the UK, where women are coming here seeking safety and sanctuary. But the first point of call, the Home Office, they don't believe these stories of the women. And I think there is, a root cause where there is a culture of disbelief at the root of Home Office decision making. And really, when women are refused, that kind of brings them down through a rabbit hole of appeals, trying to get stabilize their status, and through these processes, sometimes they are left destitute with no support. That means we have refugees in this country who are hungry and homeless on the streets of Britain. And this is because we don't recognize the special needs of women or the experiences of women that happen to them in their home countries. And one woman in particular said to me that it is not what happened to me in my home country that broke me, but is what happened to me here. And that kind of gives you the reality check of what is happening to women. And just to say that, I heard about Helen when I was working in Calais in the jungle camp. I met her friends who told me that, Helen is pregnant and she doesn't have any clothes. And so they had packed clothes for her from the Calais camp for me to take to her because she couldn't access any support in this country. So I think, what this shows is that whatever journeys that women come to, we know that they are fleeing gender-based violence, but when they get here, they're not getting the necessary recognition that they need. And we need to do more to make sure that the Home Office makes the right decision and believes these women's stories.
I'm so glad that you mentioned that women are often violated who have no roots in conflict and what happens to them in conflict. And I think while we're discussing the latter here today, it is so important to keep in mind that it is a global scourge, violence against women. It is pervasive every place, whether it's domestic violence, intimate partner violence, whether it's honor killings or dowry burnings or human trafficking. This is an enormous global problem, and we really need to work at solutions to it. It can't go on the way it is. And I really want to get into that, what do we need to do about it? You had said, Sanj, that these women aren't originally in where they were, what they were doing, vulnerable people. They're not incapacitated people. They're often really significant in their everyday lives. And yet what's happened to them is something shattering in every imaginable way. And I remember personally being in Afghanistan one night with a group of women in Kabul, and the first one said to me, "Stop looking at us as victims and look at us as the leaders that we are. Look at us as people who can make a difference." Now, IRC is doing a lot of that under the horrible circumstances in which you work. Tell us about rebuilding the capacity of these women and what kind of efforts need to be made.
I think the key thing there is that women have their own agency, and in many of the countries where we see conflict, they were already in the process of engineering positive change in their societies. For example, prior to the Yemen conflict, there was legislation championed by women's groups still working, and it's a dangerous place to work in Yemen, to end child marriage or to ensure that girls are getting a full education so that they can be productive members of society, or that structural barriers to preventing them getting employment are removed. And we've seen that this is a problem in the absence of conflict. I think Marchu is right, that there is violence present. but that people recognize that the rule of law in many cases can be used in the absence of conflict to start correcting some of these things. So, for example, in Jordan, where women have lobbied for better childcare access for Syrian refugee women so that they can take advantage of work permits being issued by Jordan, so that it isn't just men going to work, that there are women businesses, they are innovating. There are a couple of plumbers who are self-trained because they can't get access as women to plumbing training, who then go and fix problems in women-headed households where they don't want a male plumber coming into that community. So everything from the innovative plumber to legislative lobbying groups of women trying to engineer change in legislatures, even in the midst of conflict in places like Yemen, speaks to the fact that I haven't mentioned International Rescue Committee once. These are just people that we come across, that we work, we try and support, but they're doing it. And I think that's the really important thing. This can't be a northern-driven solution. It's very much about finding those people and recognizing that they're open to change. And I think the last piece on that is don't close them off because of social norms in those societies. So what am I saying? In many parts of the world, if you go and visit, you might say, well, you know, this is a culture that respects that men are the leaders. I mustn't talk to women in that community because it might upset things. It might be viewed as insulting. And in many cases, you do need to be wary if you're a male stranger talking, but don't close them off from the discussion. I mean, there are plenty of ways in which you can have a discussion with men and women about the issues in that society, regardless of how conservative it is. And that's what I've learned, I think, in the last 10 years. If you simply accept the norms and close off a huge part of society, and let's not call women a minority, 50% of that society, you're only getting one set of solutions. I'll end with one amusing anecdote about how closer to home in this society and in the US this example comes from, we exclude women to the cost of wider society. It might seem amusing, but Reshma Saujani, she did a TED talk. She's leading Girls Who Code, encouraging women to get into coding. She said, Apple, when they designed those earpods, can't have had a woman in their senior team because if you try and wear earrings with those AirPods, certain kind of earrings, it just doesn't work. If they'd had a woman, if they'd been more inclusive, they'd have designed a product that worked better. I don't know if women can relate to that, but it struck with me what she said, that diversity and inclusion of women in decision-making isn't just about women. It's about how much better society can be if we include them. And that's, I think, the key message.
That's why we're all here at the Bloomberg Equality Summit to talk about diversity and inclusion. The clock is ticking. I'm very conscious of it. Arminka, briefly, because it is a very big effort, tell us about the PSVI campaign, what it's attempting to do. There'll be another huge gathering here in London at the end of the year. Where is this going, and how does it get at solving some of the horrors that we've been talking about?
Sure. Well, I think I was very lucky to be working for William Hague, a conservative foreign secretary, with a heart of someone who I'm sure my colleagues would agree found a real synergy with NGOs and civil society groups, etc., and who took human rights and women's rights really to his heart and understood that you cannot have a foreign policy without taking that into account. And in 2012, he and Angelina Jolie, who did a film about country that I come from, a film who I would highly recommend everyone to see if you want to see what happens to women in conflict situations, a film called In the Land of Blood and Honey, describes in a very painful and minute detail what happens when a village or a town gets taken over by paramilitaries and what price women pay and how it tears them apart, how it tears their families apart. Anyway, we all got together while I was in the Foreign Office and Lord Hague was Foreign Secretary, and started Preventing Sexual Violence Initiative, the aim of which was to highlight this issue, to try and recruit as many supporters around the country and around the world as we could, and to try, at the moment we have 156 countries that has signed up to this, to create a new protocol for properly registering and properly cases of sexual violence in conflict and post-conflict situations. And we have worked since then with the UN, with G8, with NATO, with UN General Assembly, with UNHCR, with here in this country, the Ministry of Defense and Department for International Development, and we are having a review conference in November this year. We have gone and come as far as we could, and what we are now trying to do, and I work very closely with the Foreign Office, I'm not in the government anymore, is to try and create two things. One is to address the issue that Sanj has just mentioned, and it is lack of funding for fighting violence against women, and therefore I am appealing together with my colleagues who work on this to our new DFID secretary to ring fence a small percentage of DFID budget, whether it is 1 or 2% that would go towards this particular issue, so that the NGOs and then women who have been displaced don't have to wait for some funding cycle so that they can be helped, and that this is a guaranteed help out there and funding provided for them for organizations like International Rescue Committee and others. And the other issue that we are focusing on now is trying to create a momentum for establishing an independent body, an independent international mechanism that would properly not only collect the evidence, but properly prepare files for potentially taking these cases to international or regional court, etc. Because one thing that I have, every time I meet a survivor of sexual violence, whether it is a woman or a man or a girl, is one thing that they want, that they never get, is justice. So they feel that their pain and their life is worth nothing. And while we can all, I've come to a conclusion, we can all talk about it and help them and go support them, what they ultimately want to do is that they are worth something. And if they do not, and as I spoke to Melanne today, and she said that she has met a lady who has gone through this horrible experience. She today lives very traumatized existence. Still hasn't recovered from her experience that has affected her and her family. However, the perpetrator of the crime that was committed against her is an upstanding citizen and a police officer just down the road who has never taken any responsibility or paid price for his behavior. So what we are trying to do is a kind of two-track. We want to provide support for the organizations that work on the ground with women, men, whoever is impacted by this horrible crime. And secondly, we want to also work on filling this gap of accountability, i.e. collecting the evidence, properly preparing the files for eventually being taken to courts. And we have two interesting examples here that are already in existence, is that the mechanism for Syria and for Myanmar. But what strikes me is that each time when a war happens somewhere, we get this massive shock. We have a front page in The Guardian or Independent. We all get exercise about it for 24 hours, and then we all move on. At some point, we have a new body or a new mechanism in place that is going to look into this, and they have to start somewhere. So they start by finding a place where to work, finding the funding, which is usually limited, finding the people who are experts who can work on this. And what we're thinking, we should actually put a stop to this. There should be a permanent body that is licensed, that it has got its support, that it has got funding, and that it's not limited either by time or by funds, but it is only limited by the time that it's going to spend to really try and get to the bottom of a particular crisis or a particular crime that has taken place. And this is an uphill struggle. I don't know whether we succeed. I'm hoping that we will, but I think that unless we address this issue of accountability, we are really not going to make much progress.
Well, let's hope we can finally put an end to this impunity and move on. And lastly, Marchu.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say that we also have to look in our own backyard and really look at what is happening to women here, because right now some women who have come here seeking asylum are detained indefinitely in a detention center in this country. What are we doing about them? We have to put pressure on MPs to end indefinite detention and to also end the practice of making those who've come seeking safety and sanctuary destitute on the streets of Britain.
So we really need to empower those women also
Yes,
to be able to
and-
speak up for themselves.
Yes, definitely. That is the work I do in terms of empowerment, and really that the campaigns that we have, the Set Her Free campaign, which is about ending detention, is led by the refugee and asylum-seeking women that I work with. And I do a lot of training for refugee and asylum-seeking women about how empowering them and also enabling them to speak up for themselves.
Well, we hope that we would have had more time, but we don't. Unfortunately, it's always the case. But I hope we've done a little bit more than scratch the surface for you this morning. This is an enormous problem besetting our world, our countries. We really need to do a better job. These three people are doing a remarkable job. We owe them a debt of gratitude, but I hope we will leave here not just exercised for 24 hours, but really thinking, what can I, where I sit, where I work, really make a difference on this issue, because it is about all of us. So thank you all so much for what you do every day.
Thank
you.
you.